The story of Iran's economy is just full of contradictions. On one hand, you've got a country sitting on immense natural wealth. But on the other, you see decades of real, persistent economic hardship for its people. The key to understanding it is realizing you're not looking at one economy, but two, operating right alongside each other.
And that really gets us to the central paradox here. How can a nation that is, by any definition, an energy superpower, find itself in what feels like a recurring state of economic crisis? Well, the answer really pulls back the curtain on the deep structural challenges inside Iran.
All right, let's really dig into this paradox. And to do that, we first have to look at the official numbers. The stats that make Iran look like an absolute energy giant. The potential here is just staggering.
Just look at these numbers. The scale is massive. Data shows Iran holds 10% of the entire world's proven oil reserves and a whopping 15% of its natural gas. On paper, that should be the foundation for an unbelievably wealthy nation, right? Yeah, but that potential is just not the reality for most Iranians. For decades, the economy has been absolutely plagued by these persistent problems. We're talking about crazy high inflation that just eats away at your savings, growth that's basically flatlined, a currency that's always losing value. And get this, according to the IMF, a government that's been in the red running a deficit every single year for decades.
So how did we get here? Well, to figure that out, we have to look at this huge turning point, the 1979 revolution. It's like the country's economic story just split right in two, a before and an after. And wow, does this slide show you that split or what? The data, and this is from Iran's own central bank, shows that in the 2 decades before 79, the economy was booming, growing at an average of over 9% a year. That's incredible. But in the 4 decades since, it just plummeted to less than 2%. That is a monumental slowdown, and it really makes you ask, what on earth happened?
So today, the official economy, the one you read about, is this mixed, centrally planned system. It has all the usual suspects, oil and gas, agriculture, services. But here's the thing, that's just the tip of the iceberg. What's really going on beneath the surface, that's where the real power is.
Okay, so here's the absolute crucial point. A massive, and you could argue the most powerful part of Iran's economy, it operates completely outside of that formal structure we just talked about. And it's pretty much controlled by one single, very powerful group.
And this quote from Professor Ali Ansari just hits the nail on the head. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, you'll hear them called the IRGC, they're not just a military. They're a business, a massive, dominant economic force. You see, the IRGCs started out as the ideological defenders of the revolution, right? But over the decades, they've completely transformed. They've basically moved from the battlefield right into the boardroom, building this sprawling business empire that has its tentacles in pretty much every part of Iranian life. And look, this wasn't some overnight thing. It was a slow, methodical takeover. It starts after the Iran-Iraq War, they formalized their structure. Then, in the 90s, the government actually encouraged them to get into business, to fund themselves. And that just blew the doors wide open for them to get these huge, no-bid contracts. We're talking massive government projects just handed to them, no competition. And that's what really cemented their economic power.
So, how does a military group become a financial powerhouse? Well, to really get the IRGC's power, you have to do one thing: follow the money. And in Iran, that means following the oil.
Okay, so the data suggests that in 2024, Iran's oil exports were set to bring in something like $43 billion. That's the country's single biggest cash cow by far.
But, and this is the absolute kicker, that money doesn't all go into the public piggy bank. The sources are pretty clear that the IRGC has systematically taken over the oil trade, and by 2024, they controlled as much as half of all oil export money. And they do it with basically zero oversight from the civilian government. And believe me, it is not just about oil. The IRGC has pushed its influence into basically every profitable sector you can think of. Using a complicated web of front companies and holding firms, which are really just businesses set up to hide who actually owns them, they've become huge players in everything from construction and telecom to mining and real estate. So on top of all that formal business, the IRGC also runs a gigantic shadow economy. They use their control over ports, airports, and these things called invisible jetties to run a black market that one Iranian parliament member estimated could be worth a mind-boggling $12 billion a year.
Okay, so what? What does all this actually mean? What are the real-world consequences when you've got a military organization basically running a country's economy?
Well, the first huge consequence is that the elected government, the civilian government, is essentially cut off from the country's main source of cash. Think about what that means. Less money for schools, for hospitals, for roads, because a huge chunk of the nation's income is being siphoned off before it ever even gets to the public treasury.
And that's why, when you hear about international sanctions on Iran, they're often not aimed at the Iranian people, or even the government as a whole. No, as the sources point out, they are designed with surgical precision to hit the IRGC's wallet and choke off its funding.
And this leads to very specific actions, like this one from the U.S. Treasury. They went after a company called Khatam al-Anbiya, which is the massive engineering and construction arm of the IRGC, along with all its little side companies. The whole point is to make it really hard for these businesses to operate internationally and, squeeze their profits.
So, the big question, where does all that money go? Well, according to our sources, it's definitely not going into the state budget. Instead, it's used to fund the IRGC's own private agenda. Their military operations, their support for proxy groups across the region, what the U.S. Treasury calls WMD proliferation, and of course, lining the pockets of its senior commanders.
And all of this really brings us back to one final big question. This whole structure creates these two parallel economies in Iran. You've got the official one, which is stagnant and struggling under all this mismanagement, and then you have the IRGC's economy, powerful, profitable, and totally separate. And it just leaves you wondering, when a military controls the economy, who is a nation's wealth really for?